Hey there everybody, I hope you're all doing well, and for today's video I actually want to do a little bit of a brief addendum to my review of the latest episode of House of the Dragon, episode 7, Driftmark, because like episode 5, where I had a big discussion about the usage of the bury your gays trope in that episode, I, in my review of episode 7, discussed my feelings on the treatment of the show's other gay character, Laenor. And I'm going to say this right up front. If you have not seen episode 7 of House of the Dragon, I am going to have to go into full spoilers about it, about the end of that episode, so just know that going in. And so, to get to it, I took issue with the end of the episode where we see that the character of Laenor, who is a gay man and mostly been defined by the fact that he is gay as a character, have a fake-out death. But then it's revealed in the last second of the episode that he's actually living and is going off to another continent to live happily with his gay lover, Carl. Carl? Or we'll call him Carl. I know his name starts with a Q, but we're just call him Carl for this discussion. And in my review, I took issue with it for a number of reasons that I'm going to reiterate in just a second to go over. But I did see a few comments on that review that added a little bit more nuance or a couple things that I didn't think about to just discuss with this representation of a gay character. And I wanted to just actually talk about it because I do think there's more nuance, and I love to talk about the nuance of these pieces of media. I think it's always fascinating, especially when it comes to LGBTQ representation. So I figured I'd take this moment to just add those things in, discuss it in context with my issues with it, and see how it's a little bit grayer than I initially discussed it in my initial review, but why I still do have some issues with the show that the show could potentially divert in the future, or it could lean into and make me hate it even more. And so I kind of want to discuss all of that and sort of just add a little bit larger discussion to it, because I did see some people, take issues with how I shared it in my review, which is fair. I think that that's part of why we do these reviews and discussions. It's why I like talking about media, to have these conversations. So let's have it. So to reiterate what my issues were up front, was the fact that in episode 5, we had Laenor's lover in that episode be killed in a very clear bury your gays trope story. And to reiterate again, bury your gays does not mean that a character is killed for being gay. It means the trope is about the fact that gay characters are more disproportionately killed in media, stemming back from things like the Hays Code, where it said that gay people had to be punished if they appear in media, and so gay characters were often tended to be killed, and that was a remnant of the Hays Code that stuck around throughout film history, and often is done in stories up until recently, where we started to see more queer stories that actually show queer people getting to live full and happy lives and thriving, but mainly used in stories that pitied queer people, where it's like, oh, isn't it sad that the queer people have it so rough? They even die at the end, and it just makes you feel so sad. It's sort of like a pitying look at gay people, but we never actually get to see ourselves live and thrive. And you can see this in so many pieces of gay media. I mean, look at Brokeback Mountain did this, Boys Don't Cry did this, Star Trek did this a bunch, Next Generation did it in the episode The Outcast. You had it a couple times, at least metaphorically, in Star Trek Enterprise as well, with queer-coded characters that were meant to be queer allegories, if not explicitly queer within the episodes. So it's a long-running trope that's been gone throughout media for time immemorial, and only in recent years have we started to see that mold be broken. Which is why I took issue with it appearing in House of the Dragon, because it felt regressive. And it very thematically done, too, because it was, very clearly, very disgusting and gross at how it was depicted, and a little bit indulgent in the Game of Thrones way, and that is in part and parcel with how Game of Thrones films things to a degree, but it was still kind of difficult to watch, especially leaning into such a harmful trope, that gay people just don't get to see ourselves living, just have to be defined by trauma and media. So that was clearly that. And then I read a review, or an interview with the showrunner, Michael Shepwick. I can't really pronounce his name off the top of my head, but he's the showrunner that left the show at the end of the season, where he had literally stated, I think the exact quote was, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but not too much, is, I had vaguely heard of the bury your gays trope, but I don't pay attention to the internet. I live my own storytelling world. That's essentially the quote there. And I was really frustrated at that quote, because he kind of said, I don't listen to the internet, which felt like he was dismissing the bury your gays trope as a Tumblr thing. It's like, oh, people on Tumblr and Twitter talk about that, but I don't really care. When bury your gays trope is a trope that film scholars have been discussing for forever, as I just articulated about the Hays Code and things like that. There are many film scholars that go to work at universities to discuss these things professionally that talk about that trope. And so to just dismiss it as an internet thing is really frustrating. And it showed to me that he just didn't do the basic amount of research to include queer people in his thinking when he's writing a show that included queer people as characters. And then that issue was compounded a little bit by the fact that we saw the actors playing Rhaenyra and Alicent in their youth, the youth actors of those characters, playing the characters with gay subtext. They said that in interviews, saying that they did play the characters gay subtext that would get kind of erased by the time we get to the adult versions of the characters, not by the actors themselves, as the actor who plays Rhaenyra is non-binary, but by the fact that like it's become like an antagonistic relationship that lost a little bit of that nuance and that jumping ahead. And I think it loses what those actors had brought to those characters in a really nuanced and intriguing way that you don't have being brought forward because you have new actors and you've jumped 10 years. So it's like a lot of the racing of that queerness and that important queer history, and it just showed me that the showrunners just wasn't paying attention to that. So when I came to this episode, and I'm not going to future spoiler I will have something future spoilery about the book to mention in just a minute with this discussion, but I'll give you fair warning. So if you don't want to hear any spoilers for the book, I'll save it for the end. I'll discuss the end. But to compare what happens to Laenor in the book as a character, this isn't a spoiler for the book because it's already happened on the show. But Laenor in the book kind of dies, clearly dies, or at least it is stated. The book is kind of a historical text with like someone like analyzing history. So it's like you're reading a textbook, and it is stated that he died, but the person Mushroom, who is this court jester guy, who we see briefly in the show, is an unreliable narrator. And the person writing the book in the book, it literally states that we don't have, 100% proof that, Laenor died, the gay character in the episode. And so that was the content. And then after that, like the character doesn't really appear in the book at all. And so it leads to my assumption that like, okay, so what they're going to do with this character is they're going to kill him off or write him off in some way after this point. So when I watched the episode and we get this fake out death, first off, the fake out death was like, they're leaning into the Barry Gaze trope. They're doing a Barry Gaze trope again. This time because he is gay. Because the reason that they kill him in the show, quote unquote, is because he is gay and he cannot be a good husband to Rhaenyra politically at all. Because he's a liability politically because they can't have kids. And so that leaves her open to be attacked with bastard children. And also her claim, and also not just because he's gay as well, but mainly because he's gay. But also she has a better claim if she marries, her uncle, which is Game of Thrones. But in large part of the reason that he is politically inconvenient for her is because he is gay. And so to kill a gay character because he is gay is an even worse usage of the trope. At the very least in episode 5, while that character was defined as gay, his only major characteristic was he was gay. At least he wasn't necessarily 100% killed for being gay. But still Barry a Gay's trope. But at least it wasn't that, and that would have been that problem. But they did do a subversion at the end here where Laenor lives. Now, my issue was that even though he lives at the end, I came into it with the kind of assumption based off the book that since Laenor doesn't appear after this is them writing him out of the show. And I took issue with that because it felt like the show being like, well, we're not really doing a Barrier Gaze, but we're doing a Barrier Gaze. Like, he gets to live. We're sending him to the gay farm upstate. He gets to live with his gay friends, all happy elsewhere. But he's not going to be in the show anymore. And that just felt me as like, you're doing the gay Barry Gaze trope without doing the Barry Gaze trope. They did a similar thing in The Boys recently, where a gay character in that show, in the source material, the comics of The Boys that are based off of, the character dies. But in the show, the character has a moment where they should have died, but actually lives, but then is leaving the show anyways. Like, well, I'm going to go move out of this and never have to deal with these problems again. So it's like doing the Barrier Gaze trope without doing the Barrier Gaze trope. And it's an acknowledgement by the show that and the writers that the trope is harmful and that they shouldn't do it, but not really having the willingness to change the source material in a way that would update it for a day that recognizes that these tropes are harmful. So that was my assumption coming into this depiction of Allure, that like now that he's here and if he's effectively written out of the show, then I have a problem with that because it's still leaning into the trope, even if they're like undercutting it a little bit and making it a little bit better, but it's still like the next worst thing that you can do. And it also in some ways makes it feel worse because it's like acknowledging the problem but still kind of doing it. So that was my take in my review, coming off of all the problematic stuff too from episode 5 and the showrunner's comments. But a couple of things that people brought to my attention, I'm like, okay, I can see this. First off, I do hear people when they say, well, he gets a happy ending. And for queer characters, as I said, because we have to deal with the Barry gaze trope so much, getting a happy ending is nice, especially in a Game of Thrones show where characters don't really get happy endings. So for a character to get a happy ending, a gay character, that's nice. And I hear you. I hear that that's cathartic. It sucks that it had to come off of a scene where you thought he was going to die, because that really touches upon that moment again, emotionally. But at least you're like, okay, I can understand why that can be cathartic for people, especially in a show like Game of Thrones. I still take issue with that argument to a degree. While I appreciate that, and I certainly understand that, and I don't want to diminish that, because that certainly we should celebrate like gay characters getting to live. But I still take issue to a degree because he is the only gay character that we have in the show so far. So if he is being written out of the show, even if he gets a happy ending, it is still like the show kind of being like, especially if he's written out because he's gay, like the character's leaving this, like the situation because he is gay. It's still an acknowledgement by the show being like, well, we just wanted to have this gay character around so we could like use him for being a gay character, then get rid of him from the story. And while in the show it is nice that the character gets that, it is rough for me to be like, this show's going to have another 2 or 3 seasons, and the one gay character that we had, at least in this season so far, is now gone. And maybe we'll get more gay characters down the line. That would be great. I would love that. But at this point, I can only base off of what I see. And what I see is you had 2 gay characters, killed one, and then wrote one off. And then have no seeming intention to write any more. Especially based off the showrunner's comments. And that bugs me as a gay person. And people will be, and I've heard comments being like, well, not everything has to be about you. Why do you always need to have gay characters in shows? Well, it's like, number one, we shouldn't have to argue for our inclusion in things, you know? Gay people exist. We should be allowed to be included in our fantasy worlds as well as you. And you see that with things like Lord of the Rings or all these TV shows nowadays where it's like, well, black doors wouldn't exist in this world because the melanin count in doors would be like whatever bullshit justification people want to make up to say that, people of color, queer people, whatever, wouldn't exist in fantasy worlds. I saw someone saying like, oh, we shouldn't like contemporize LGBTQ identities into fantasy and science fiction. And the implication there is like that gay people are contemporary and that we didn't exist in the past. Like, no, queer people exist in the past. You're seeing this a lot with trans people now. It's like trans people didn't really, this is a Western invention. Trans people all existed throughout history. Maybe in different ways or different, we wouldn't necessarily use the same words we would now, but trans people always existed. Same with LGBTQ people, and that's a stigma too. It's like, oh, gayness is just a new thing, new fad. That was like a stigma against gay people for a long time. That's just recently started to be acknowledged as bullshit, but was a big stigma. Because gay people did always exist. And so to say like, well, we're contemporizing gay people in fantasy, like, no, gay people would exist in fantasy worlds, just like they would in like medieval times. Many gay people existed in the aristocracy and were able to get away with being gay publicly because they were rich. But also gay people existed as poor people. And yes, they faced a lot more stigma and discrimination, but we also existed there too. So for people to say like, oh, you shouldn't exist in a fantasy thing, I think is bunk and offensive to a degree. And then people saying like, well, why do you always need to be in every single thing? It's like, well, we shouldn't have to justify us being in things. If 10% of the population is gay, we should be at least 1 in 10 characters, And also like, gay people have been historically underrepresented for decades now. And so, you know what? Screw it. I want a little bit of overrepresentation to make up for the decades where I wasn't included. But even if I wasn't making that argument, we should still be included regardless. We should still be, 1 in 10 characters, to use that pull out of my butt statistic, So that's why I still have an issue, even if he's being written out of the show happily. I still have an issue with him being written out of the show. However, the other argument that people made to me that was much more intriguing is like, well, how do we know he's being written out of the show? He doesn't appear in the books later, but he might still appear in the show. The show may be like, well, maybe he'll help from the sidelines, off to the side, and like be an agent for her in Essos, and we get to see him there. And that argument I actually really like. If the show included a gay character doing that work, and actually like gave him more representation than the book did, oh yeah, I'm here for that. 100% here for that. I would love that, actually. We don't know that. And my feeling is, maybe I'll be wrong, but this is my guess. My guess is that Laenor will not appear in the rest of the season. Because judging by the showrunner's statements, in the last interview that I discussed, the one that I discussed, I feel like he was just using gay people as props. It really feels that way. And so I would be surprised if he does show up in the next few episodes. And this was just an element to get us to the next bit of the story. I might be wrong in that, and if I am, I will gladly eat my words and be so pleased. I will be so happy about it. I will be the first to say I was wrong, and I'll be pleased. But that's the vibe I get from the showrunner. My guess will be, like, maybe due to the backlash, the fact that showrunner I talk about is leaving the show and a new showrunner is coming in. I think one of the women writers on the show is stepping into showrunner, and I hope that's the case. If that's the case, then I think we might see him come back in future seasons. Because then they'll be like, oh, that was a problem. Maybe we'll write him in. And it'll be like an acknowledgement of the writers that, like, oh, we'll bring him in. And I'll be like, I see what you did. I still want that, but I see what you did. you still leaned into the trope and recognized it after you did it, which I prefer. It's something Star Trek Discovery did much worse. Star Trek Discovery, spoiler for that show, a gay character gets murdered in the first season. The writers realized that was a problem leaning into the Barry Gay trope, so they brought him back to life in the second season. It'd be generally the same thing, though a little bit better because he didn't actually die. It would be less forced, I guess, would be the best way to put it. But I would still see it that way. I'd have less of an issue with it than I did with Star Trek Discovery. But I'd still recognize the same fundamental dynamics going on. But we'll see. I can't know. But if that's the case, I will happily eat my words on that. I would still say, though, you should have more LGBTQ representation in the show, just generally. If you're going to do tropes like this, do them better, especially in the case of episode 5. And if you're going to write a character, I don't know, I just still feel like you should have maybe 1 or 2 more gay characters, maybe a lesbian or something like that. Bisexual person. Hell, a gender non-conforming person like you had with characters like Arya or Brienne of Tarth. And know that they're not technically queer, but it would be nice to see that, whereas you don't really have that in this show. They're like queer adjacent, I guess you'd say. You'd even have a trans character, would be fascinating to me. Maybe that would be interesting, but who knows? But anyways, I'm not here to, like, there are numerous things that you could do. And I think that, like, if you're going to lean into these tropes of characters like this, I think, I am someone who is like, I will hear, there are people who's like, you can never do a Barry Gaze trope. And I am generally on the side of, like, you shouldn't do it overall if you can avoid it. I am willing to hear an argument for a Barry Gaze trope, but my thing will be, like, if you're going to do it really well, the best version of it you can, which was definitely not the case in 5. I would still say even here, even though he gets to live, I would still say even if this is the end of his character, it's still not it's a better version of Barrier Gaze. Again, he gets to live, sort of an adapted version of it. But I still say even then it's not great because he's still a character who's, like, mostly defined by being gay and not really a full character. He doesn't have much else going on besides being gay and sad and frustrated that he can't be openly gay. Like, that's his main thing as a character. He's defined by his gayness in a lot of senses. And so I would still say that that's not a great usage of the trope, even if you're going to subvert it. So it's like, my argument would be, like, if you're going to do the Barry Gaze trope, do it better, which I don't feel like the show did. They did slightly better in one case, but not great. And you should have more LGBTQ people to showcase, like, you didn't just want to use the gay characters for the Barry Gaze trope for your story, but you're allowing us to be seen as inclusive in this world, regardless of where you're going to throw us into these tropes, which they didn't do. So at the end of the day, what my feeling is I have complicated feelings on this character's usage in this story. If he comes back, especially if he comes back this season, I'll gladly eat my words. Though I would still like to see more LGBTQ characters, and I still have issues with the usage of episode 5 character, I will at least be like, you know what? Maybe I should have given them a little bit more trust. I still have issues, but you know what? I appreciate this, and I'll eat a little bit of crow, even with my criticisms. If he doesn't come back this season, but he comes back next season, I'll be like, I still appreciate this, but I still see what happened here. And if he doesn't come back at all, then I'm still angry for all the reasons that I depicted. There you go. That's my thoughts on this. I hope that adds nuance. And last thing to say, by the way, I hope this goes without saying, I still like this show, even though I have issues. Because we're on YouTube and everything gets essentialized in either you love or you hate something. Whenever someone has a criticism, whenever I have a criticism, people are like, Jesse, you hate it. You disgust. Yeah, you think you're going to cancel it. You think it's like, oh, homophobic. You're going to call them homophobic. It's like, no, I'm not saying these people hate gay people. I'm not saying I hate the show. I'm saying they leaned into tropes, which are very easy to do if you're not actually doing the work to learn about these things, which clearly I don't think the showrunner evidently didn't do. Even if he does subvert it in some ways, it's clear that, like, he didn't, in his statements, it's clear he didn't do that. And I find that bothersome. But I'm not saying he's a raging homophobe or that this show is homophobic and, like, the most offensive to me as most offensive thing I've ever seen as a queer person. No, I just, like, we can have nuanced critiques of things and not essentialize it as, like, homophobic or terrible. I like this show. I enjoy it. I have issues with how it's depicted gay characters. I'm not tossing it with bin. I'm not saying it's the most homophobic thing ever. I say I have issues. And let's talk about the issues rather than essentializing it as Jesse hates the show or Jesse's calling these people homophobic. And that's really reductive. And it's frustrating that this conversations always end up in those reductive modes. You know? I find that tiring. It's honestly kind of hurtful as a creator sometimes to just constantly be barraged with people essentializing your views in the most simplistic and reductive way as if you hate people. It's frustrating, to be kind of frank with you. And I'll leave it there. So that's my thoughts on this situation. I hope that was helpful and illuminating. And please, still feel free to disagree with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll leave it there. I love you all. Take care of yourselves, my friends, and I hope you all live long and prosper.